morning, everyone. Good afternoon. Good
Morning.
evening, middle of the night for some of us. Thank you all so very much for joining us again. And as Tina said yesterday, which I thought was quite clever, these two gentlemen don't need any introduction because they've already been introduced. So I will pass the virtual microphone to both Professor Slezkine and Professor Kimmage to start today's talk, Russia and America Between Civilizations, a Conversation. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jarlath. And I think, Yuri, maybe we'll just dive right in. And I'm going to begin with a few questions that I'll ask Professor Slezkine, and we'll offer some thoughts of my own along the way. And we'll hope to occupy 45 minutes in that manner, and then are very eager to have a conversation with you about ideas relating to the U.S., to Russia, U.S.-Russian relations, and to civilization. And I wanted to begin, Yuri, with that as the very first point. And I think that it's fair to say at the moment that civilizational discourse, or references to civilization in academic and intellectual life, are unfashionable. They're abundant in the late 19th century, going back even to the 18th century. In the early 19th century, early 20th century, think of a blockbuster book like Oswald Spengler's Decline of the West, and then even into mid-century with Toynbee and other sort of best-selling historians who framed their work around the notion of civilization. And the last 20 or 30 years have shown, maybe longer, that this framing device, the sort of narrative device, this angle of vision, has become unfashionable. Although you do have in the mid-1990s the Huntington book, Clash of Civilizations, and a lively conversation around that. So I wanted to begin there because it felt to me, and I think that this is reflected in your scholarship as well, that there's a lot to be gained from looking at civilization, and that it's still sort of fresh and relevant, and furthermore quite helpful to an understanding of foreign affairs at the present moment, even if it is unfashionable. So I want to sort of begin there as a first comment or question of sorts, just the status of civilization at the present moment, and why it's not embraced, but why it may still be significant.
Well, I agree with you that it is unfashionable, but somehow present one way or another. In academia, I can think of one field where it is not unfashionable, where it is respectable at the very least, and that is Eisenstadt's work. I don't know, maybe some of you know. All sorts of literature connected to the problem of the axial age and axial age civilizations. And that is a small but very active and very vibrant field. So that of course is fairly remote from Huntington's work and what we hear mostly with regard to international affairs. Although again, Huntington is interesting. He's very fashionable as a straw man, right? So many texts begin with a kick in his direction. So it's present in that way as well. And then in political rhetoric, but you, Michael, know a lot more about this than I do. In this country, the world, I mean, in the United States, because I'm quite far from you all now. But in the United States, the word civilization is rarely used. And certainly and we'll talk more about this, the concept of Western civilization is pretty much gone. But the world is often seen in ways that Huntington would have no trouble recognizing. And indeed, so many, Brodel and others who wrote about civilizations would easily recognize. For a while, like the war on terror seemed to be a kind of civilizational struggle, with the word crusade used occasionally, and perhaps predictably. And the two main opponents most frequently mentioned are China and Russia, with India as an important newcomer to the club of great powers. In other words, again, sort of Huntington's scheme seems to be alive, if not well, and useful, if not always recognized. And of course, since we're talking about Russia and the US, on the Russian side, the West is the opposite number, and the clearly understood as a civilization. But that is interesting, and perhaps we should talk about this a little later, because I don't know if you have read Lavrov's recent article. Has anyone read it yet? But yeah, Russia's foreign minister Lavrov published 2 or 3 days ago, published an article in which he essentially juxtaposes the West to the rest of the world, which is of course a more or less constant theme in Russian political rhetoric. The interesting thing is that sometimes the West is represented as strong, vigorous, overbearing, pushing its values, seeing itself as a civilization and imposing its civilizational values on others, and sometimes as a peculiar culture that has turned on itself, with Russia perhaps actually there to defend whatever is left of Western civilization, because in Russia you still can use that term. So anyway, we can talk more about some of these things, and obviously you have written a lot about it.
I feel, and we will, sort of turn very shortly to the subject of U.S.-Russian relations, but a certain schizophrenia living in Washington, D.C., where notions and norms of the West are very much alive. When you mentioned Lavrov's article, there's regular writing from somebody like Dan Fried. I'm not sure if the name is familiar to you, but a sort of leading American diplomat and expert on Eastern Europe that's extremely civilizational and makes a very stark divide between, say, Ukraine and Russia, putting Ukraine firmly in the West, Kiev as a kind of city of Western liberties and Moscow as a kind of dark Eastern civilization. So you have that flourishes in some ways in Washington, sort of dichotomies and hierarchies of civilization. And then you have American academia where that kind of thinking would be absolutely anathema. So it's difficult to say what's the American voice or what's the American frame.
Right.
These sort of gradations, and the place where the West is most robustly alive is Washington, D.C., and perhaps where it's most robustly questioned would be Berkeley, California. And that's a kind of interesting tension. My own graduate program, which was created in 1937 at Harvard, in American Studies, the first American Studies program in American academia, was called the History of American Civilization program. And within the last 10 years, graduate students revolted against that name and had it renamed American Studies, which shows not just that civilization is sort of unfashionable, but there's almost something repugnant about the word in an academic setting. And we can try to sort of understand why that might be the case as we travel down the road of this conversation. And with that in mind, Yuri, I wanted to say a few words about the sort of beginning of the story in the American context, and then turn to ask you about sort of Russia and its place in sort of Christian civilizational schemes, its place in Europe, and I think we might here return also to the figure of Huntington as well. I'll mention as a footnote that for anyone interested in the Ukraine crisis, even if you think Huntington is a second-rate xenophobic political scientist, which many do, his chapter on Ukraine, of course, it's 1993, 1995, the book version of it is oddly prophetic. It says the problem with Ukraine is that the sort of line of civilization cuts through the country, and that will have geopolitical consequences, which is a potential reading of that crisis. But before we get to 2014 and to more recent moments, I'll just say a brief word about, I think, where the American story begins when it comes to sort of civilizational self-conceptions and foreign policy. And I would say that there are three pillars on which it rests, three sort of 18th century or 17th century pillars on which the first chapter rests. And it's very much connected to the Old Testament and to a notion of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and other settlements, British colonies, as a kind of new Israel. And you see that in a lot of American place names. New Canaan, Connecticut, is to me the sort of best example of the Israelites having crossed, the Puritans having crossed the Red Sea of the Atlantic, having fled the sort of various European pharaohs and having established a new Canaan in the Americas. And that is something that very much informs a rhetoric that still matters to American foreign policy. So from the Sermon on the Mount, the phrase "city on a hill" is referenced by John Winthrop, the founder of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and that was a favorite phrase of Ronald Reagan, since the United States is supposed to be a beacon, a kind of a place of spiritual excellence, but also of political excellence, and in that sense, a kind of model to the world. And this is true for many countries, but this notion of the country as a new Jerusalem, and I think that that's very much present in Russian political culture as well, religious political culture, but that is crucial to the 17th century sort of self-conception, not quite of American citizens yet, but of those who will go on to found the Republic. Having mentioned the word Republic, the second pillar in the American context is clearly a connection to classical antiquity. And here there's the sense of the United States, of the Republic that is founded between the 1770s and 1780s as either a new Athens or a new Rome, some sort of merger of the two. And so you get Capitol Hill spelled with an O, which is meant to evoke the Capitoline Hill in Rome, and any number of architectural features in Washington that are supposed to suggest kind of refashioning of either the Roman Republic or the Roman Empire. The Potomac River used to have a little tributary called the Tiber Creek, and it just goes on without end. You know, Monticello and the architecture there, University of Virginia, all of these sort of imaginings of a kind of classical antiquity reborn. And here you get the notion of the United States as a fulfillment of the European promise, that there are all these European developments from antiquity to modern times. And the fulfillment comes with the acquisition of American liberties. And then thirdly, a kind of indigenous American sensibility. And so you get on the currency, the phrase in Latin, new order of the ages, and something that just comes about through the American newness. But here you almost get a synthesis of the previous two pillars, sort of an exemplary society, a place that will sort of show Europe and show the rest of the world what can be possible. And here republicanism would matter a bit less than the word democracy. And so these are all civilizational schemes, or these are all pieces of civilizational schemes that are powerfully present in American political culture, that inform manifest destiny in the 19th century, and the still very current idea of American exceptionalism, robustly endorsed by Barack Obama and other sort of recent American politicians. Even if these sound sort of very outmoded, sort of out of sync with contemporary American culture, you just have to look to the speeches of American politicians, including Joe Biden and Donald Trump, and you'll find lots of evidence for the lasting prevalence of these patterns and these schemes. So that's what I would say sort of in a nutshell about the American case. And now, Yuri, I'd like to turn to you and sort of ask about Russia's connections to these. It's actually, I would say, a similar set of ideas, really.
It's interesting also that, again, to get back to Huntington, to remember that he is not sure whether it's the Orthodox civilization or Russian civilization, whether that difference really matters. And that, I think, is partly due to the fact that obviously civilizations can be defined in a variety of ways. And probably the most common definition, and the one I think used by Huntington, is that it's culture writ large, the largest possible cultural community, short of humanity as a whole. And that's the definition he explicitly endorses. But there is another one that I think he occasionally endorses implicitly, and that's the one used by William McNeill in his tremendously influential book, The Rise of the West, that actually, Michael, you devote a few pages of your book to, more than a few, in fact. And that is that civilization is the largest possible community united by shared literary canon and expectations about human behavior framed by that canon. And I think that Huntington occasionally has that definition in mind when he says, well, maybe Africa is not quite a civilization and Latin America may or may not be. And then Orthodox, not quite sure. And this is one thing that I think is very important, is that while Western civilization today is, as a concept, is in exile, it was, at least according to this definition, it was certainly a reality for about 1,000 years, in that Western Christendom was a community united by a shared literary canon and by an intellectual, spiritual lingua franca, Latin. The Orthodox civilization, if we think about it as a civilization, is not really comparable, is that it did not have a large, cohesive, supranational intellectual elite that Western Christendom possessed. And of course, there was no common language. There was nothing to play the role of Latin, because Greek Christian texts were early on translated into, well, originally a couple of Slavic dialects. And so there is sort of a problem, and I think it can be seen in today's political and intellectual discussions in Russia. This sort of lack of self-confidence as a civilization, and an uncertainty that, of course, has been discussed on so many occasions in so many different ways, about whether the Orthodox world is comparable to Western Christendom as a civilization. And according to certain criteria, it certainly isn't. And whether after the fall of Byzantium, Russia is indeed a civilization. But then if you take some of those criteria discussed among others by so many others, but also by Huntington, Russia doesn't seem, as a large community united by a shared literary canon, doesn't seem, or did not seem up until the mid-19th century comparable, remotely comparable to some of those others that are routinely mentioned as part of that list, and that is Sinic, or Chinese, Hindu or Indian, Japanese perhaps, and Islamic and Western. But what I also, one other thing I wanted to say is that if we think of the West as at least a former civilization, a community that used to be united by a shared literary canon, which, if we're talking about Christian Europe, Western Europe, consisted of two sets of texts, right? Christian texts in Latin, and then the Greco-Roman canon organized fundamentally around Homer and Virgil. That certainly is not true of the Orthodox civilization. There was nothing like that. But what is interesting is that that world comes to an end, or rather begins to fade, and then eventually comes to an end after the 16th, 17th centuries, right? When French for a while replaces Latin as the intellectual lingua franca. Vernacular translations of the Bible essentially dethrone Latin as the spiritual lingua franca in the Protestant world. And then the English pioneer the cult of national bards by canonizing Shakespeare in the mid 18th century. And then everyone follows and Western civilization as a cohesive civilization, according to that definition, essentially ceases to exist by the turn of the 20th century, when education systems are organized throughout the Western world, and indeed moving into the Orthodox world. At that point, the distinction ceases to be meaningful, organized around vernacular canons. And that's where, you know, structurally, functionally, the cult of Pushkin is not very different from the cult of Cervantes and so on. But the education systems move away from the Christian and Greco-Roman curricula. And that is what I think is very interesting, is that at that moment, the US does not follow that. At least I don't know if, Michael, if you agree, but it seems striking that the US does not follow that, does not go down that path. It doesn't enthrone Longfellow or Mark Twain or whomever, the way all Europeans did, including, you know, from Rustaveli in Georgia to Petöfi in Hungary, Mickiewicz in Poland, Pushkin in Russia, Shevchenko in Ukraine, and so on. The US keeps its political documents as centrally sacred, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. And that is interesting. Maybe, Michael, you could say a few words about this apparent paradox, that it is at the time when the US introduces Western civilization as part of its core college curriculum at the turn of the 20th century, that it is at that time that it does not follow what everyone else in that Western civilization seems to be doing. In other words, there is this revolution of nationalization, national fragmentation, or confession, whatever you call it, elsewhere, blurring the divide between what used to be Western and Eastern Christendom. But the US is different. And so, in other words, just to conclude, Russia is peculiar on the list of Huntington's civilization because of its apparent feebleness, because of its thinness as a civilization compared to China, India, Islam, and so on. And what, after all, you know, other than the cult of Pushkin, it's not clear, since it's not any different from any other such cult. It's not comparable to what we find in China and so on. And the US is also exceptional in that sense when it comes to this sort of civilizational location. What do you think?
Yes, I think that it is a sort of startling point. It's at the turn of the century that American universities begin to create Western civilization curricula. It was almost impossible to study American literature at an American university in the 19th century. It was considered to be just not civilizationally important enough, ironically. And then you have, you know, sort of Greek and Latin as requirements for entering the world of higher education. That begins to get abolished in the late 19th century. And then sort of this notion of the West is democratized to a degree by allowing students to read in translation the Western canon. That's the program that Columbia begins around 1918, 1919. You have debates at Princeton at the present moment about whether classics majors are going to be required to read Greek and Latin, but this was debated in a sort of different sense 100 years ago. And then you have in the 20s and 30s an incredibly Europhilic notion of what culture was and what higher education was. It's not until the 1960s really that some of that is sort of cast off and a multicultural American curriculum begins to achieve a great deal more prominence. I happen to have been in the National Gallery in Washington, D.C. yesterday. It is a remarkable National Gallery in the sense that 3/4 of the art in the old wing of the National Gallery is not American, it's all European. So what kind of nation is that has 3/4 of its art that's imported from some other place? But it's a very telling detail, and I think goes to the heart of what you're describing. So the orientation toward the West and still toward the classical world to a great extent is really quite profound in the first half of the 20th.
And if I, Michael, if I may just insert one thing, it's interesting because I was just a few days ago at the National Gallery in Latvia, here in Riga, where I am right now. And it's obviously the opposite. It's a completely different story, the exact opposite, in that there's nothing but Latvian art, and preferably by ethnic Latvian painters. And so what at least Lavrov and others call the West includes some very different cultural civilizational arrangements, right? From a mono-ethnic state with its history and history of its art depicted accordingly in places like Latvia, Estonia, Poland, Hungary, and so on. And then there is Western Europe, but we'll talk later about it, where that sort of bard-centered, vernacular canon-centered culture is in the decline. And then there is the US with its own peculiar story.
Yes, I think some of what you mentioned before about the self-confidence in itself as a situation is although different in valence, as much an American phenomenon as it is a Russian phenomenon. Think of the last paragraph of Tocqueville's Democracy in America from the 1830s, where he predicts that these two kind of massive but sort of uncivilized powers at the periphery of Europe are going to dominate the 20th century. That's a French view, but you can sort of feel that within the US and Russia as well. Yuri, I was hoping now to turn to the early Cold War. It's to fast forward quite a bit, although we've spoken just a moment ago about the first half of the 20th century. Let me just offer a few thoughts about the US as a sort of foreign policy civilization in the 1940s and 50s, and then you know, we can turn our attention to the Soviet Union. So you already mentioned a moment ago a very remarkable book published in 1963 by the University of Chicago historian William McNeill, which was, you know, assigned for decades and you know, sort of a great academic blockbuster of its time, National Book Award winner, and very, very celebrated book. And this tells the story that was, in a sense, being told in American foreign policy as well at the time, which was Greek liberties adopted by Rome, and then informing many different patterns within European history, brought in effect to the American colonies by the British, and then absorbed into a American political system and brought to a very high level of cultural civilizational achievement by the middle of the 20th century. Interestingly, McNeill's book, this is just a footnote, doesn't accept fully the dichotomies of the Cold War, so doesn't exclude the Soviet Union from this story, or doesn't exclude Russia from this story, and it's not a sort of either or book, but it is very much, as you would gather from its title, The Rise of the West. It's very much a celebration of Western liberties, and you see that across American foreign policy thinking of the 1940s and 50s, whether it's Dean Acheson or George Kennan or others. There's a very strong sense that the reconstitution of Europe after 1945, the construction of the NATO alliance, the Marshall Plan, the sort of main lines of American Cold War foreign policy were all not just military and economic in nature, but also civilizational. It was sort of the task of the United States. This is how this generation of foreign policy makers understood their position. It was their task both to restore and to defend Western civilization. You'll see this language all through Truman's speeches. Truman, who never went to college, but was enamored of the notion of Western civilization. You see it more than you would expect in Eisenhower's speeches. The sort of gray, dull, drab rhetoric of Eisenhower is very often civilizational in nature. He writes a letter to American soldiers during the Second World War and says, you cannot destroy, to officers and soldiers, you cannot destroy any cultural landmark, speaking specifically of France and Germany, because that's what this war is about. It's about the preservation of these civilizational structures, institutions, and legacies. And that's Eisenhower, who's sort of the least romantic or poetic of American presidents, but that was his purview. And then certainly Kennedy as well, whose speech in West Berlin, 1963, summer of 1963, comes out the same year as McNeill's book. And not only does he say, Ich bin ein Berliner, that's the phrase that he's famous for, but also in that speech in West Berlin, he says, civis Romanus sum, using the Latin words to say that he's a sort of citizen of the newfound Roman Empire, which is the transatlantic relationship by 1963. And I think he's sort of welcoming Germany back into the club of civilized nations with that Latin phrase in West Berlin. So the bonds of the alliance are civilizational, and in some ways the goals of the transatlantic alliance in these years are civilizational. And there was no ambiguity about what that civilization was. It was the civilization of the West. So I think that that's a fair generalization, perhaps, of American foreign policy from 1945 to 1963. And it would be very interesting to turn our gaze in those years to the Soviet Union, which is, of course, competing over the same sort of territories and for the allegiance of the same countries in these years.
I would add one thing to your description, or at least propose one thing in connection to your description of sort of US civilizational claims during the Cold War. And that is, I think, the presence of a tension between the West and the free world, between the sort of cultural and global. On the one hand, the US led and represented a particular civilizational, cultural, political tradition. On the other, it led, and at least considered representing, the entire world minus the Soviet Union and its satellites. And that did create, I think, some tension that led to the collapse of or at least the decline of the free world. And we'll talk about the decline of the sort of West centered rhetoric, but also of the free world centered rhetoric in the, I guess, by the early 70s or so, especially with the rise of the third world that claimed to owe allegiance to neither. But on the Soviet side, again, we see perhaps a stronger tension, but two and maybe even three components. One, obviously, is the Russian one that is reborn in the early to mid 1930s, growing considerably during the war. And then rising, if not to the top, but right and looming very large in the early Cold War years, and the various Russian civilizational claims. And then, of course, there is Marxism, Leninism, which one could, I suppose, also call a civilization, right? In the sense that it was a large community, like, Islam, a very large community united by a common, let it be recent, but still united by a literary canon, or by a set of sacred texts, one could say essentially the same thing. But it proved, and I think it was felt fairly early on already in the Soviet Union, to be a fairly thin civilization. In the Soviet Union, already in the early 1930s, Marxism lost out resoundingly to the Russian vernacular canon of the 19th century as the center of the education system. It's something I think that's very important and rarely remarked upon, that from the early 1930s and all through the Soviet period, and of course into our world today, the Russian or Soviet Russian education system was organized around the Russian literary canon, with no one really reading Marx or Lenin in school. So that it was a civilization, it was official, it was subscribed to, it was invoked on so many different occasions. It was used to legitimize the regime, and I think that's one reason for its eventual collapse, is its very poor rootedness compared to this case in China, for example, where it was nationalized early on. But anyway, so the Soviet Union, to some degree, represented Russia, more so, at least for external consumption, representing Marxism, Leninism, with, interestingly enough, whereas on the Western side or on the US side, freedom and free Europe, free, radio liberty, whatever it is, free enterprise, everything was one way or another about freedom and liberty. In the Soviet Union positioned itself mostly as the champion of peace, right? Already starting in, certainly, I think in the early 50s, you are a much bigger expert on this than I am, but it certainly was big in the 60s and 70s, was the main sort of proclaimed goal of Soviet foreign policy was peace, struggle for peace. No, not really with, freedom in the Marxist sense was pretty much gone, which had been so prominent in the 1920s. And liberation was reserved primarily for nationally defined units, national liberation. And so there were, one could say that in civilizational terms, there were two sets of texts, sets of goals, sets of claims. And both of them were self-contradictory and uncertain and changing over time. And then I would add just one thing that the two had in common, and certainly toward the end, especially of World War II, on the Soviet side, claims were made that the Soviet army was there to protect our common civilization from barbarism. And that was at least one context in which it was argued very vehemently, and I think ultimately very successfully, that the Soviet Great Patriotic War was not against Germans as a nation, but against a particular ideological plague. So just to conclude, I think that the sort of US claims were a little less schizophrenic, but that both were not entirely unitary and not entirely consistent, and sometimes wildly inconsistent.
Two very brief responses before moving on to more recent moments. One about barbarism, and the other about the free world. I'll start with the free world. I think that there is a sort of period of almost utopian optimism in the 1950s about what the US could accomplish through development and sort of through the Cold War in the third world, and that just crashed into the reef of the Vietnam War and decolonization in general, which was very, very difficult for the US to deal with during the Cold War, and it so often came out on the wrong side of various post-colonial conflicts. And so it sort of almost retreated back into the West. And then, of course, you had the revival of dissident movements in Eastern Europe in the 1980s and sort of 1989, the collapse of communism in Europe. And that became the thing that was celebrated. But the more you look into the sort of third world or post-colonial non-aligned dimensions of the Cold War, the more you see, sort of policy failures and policy confusion in the US. And so that, I think, notion of the free world never, sort of succeeded in those terms. And then just in terms of barbarism, it's so interesting what you say, Yuri, about the Second World War as a war against barbarism. I just was struck by a quote from Averell Harriman, who was US ambassador to the Soviet Union and sort of close confidant of many presidents. And he said that the worst thing about the Second World War is that it's brought barbarism, it's opened the gates of Europe to barbarism, by which he meant Asia, by which he meant the Soviet Union, by which he meant Russia. So the steps of Asia have been opened and European civilization has been, in a sense, invaded, which to me is just such a peculiar reading of the Second World War, but was perhaps not so uncommon in the 1940s. So you get conflicting notions of barbarism, which must speak to conflicting notions of civilization. Mm-hmm. Those two terms are, of course, always paired one with the other. Let's go, for purposes of time, I was hoping to go sort of through the 1990s and the collapse of the Soviet Union to that decade, and perhaps we can make reference to that, or if students have questions about that period, we can return to it. But for purposes of time, let's jump all the way up to 2014. And the sort of impasse that you see in 2014, which I'm convinced is an impasse not just of foreign policy, but also of some cultural imagination and cultural language. And I'll just generalize very briefly about Russia, although without really sufficient knowledge in this respect, but a sort of Kremlin perception of the US hunger for primacy. And you were mentioning Lavrov's article, the sense of the West as a vigorous, strong element that imposes itself either on Russia or its neighbors, or alternately, and this can be a similar version of the same argument, that by westernizing Ukraine, what the United States is doing is sort of fundamentally trying to weaken Russia, playing the borderlands off of Russia in a very old game of politics and civilization. And that, if truly held by Russian policymakers, Putin and other policymakers, leads to conflict. And then you have another justification for conflict on the side of the United States, where you have the Washington, DC perception that Russia is promoting a Russian world, that it's using the dark arts of its propaganda and sort of media apparatus, espionage apparatus to impose its civilization on sort of border populations that don't want it. You often hear the argument in Washington that Putin seeks to reconstitute the Soviet Union, sort of bring about this old structure, and sort of a neo-Soviet reading of Russian foreign policy, which too, if it's a correct assessment of sort of Russian intents, would really lead to a very conflictual approach. And so I guess my generalization is that you sort of have civilizational incentives on both sides since 2014 to engage in conflict. And I would be very curious, Woody, to get your thoughts on, it's not the typical reading of 2014 to the present, but I think it's a possible one.
Well, I think there is I'm not sure that, again, this is, more about this, and there you all are in the United States right now, but I'm not sure that Russia is described in American political rhetoric in the media and so on as a civilization, unlike China, and its goals as somehow civilization. There's a huge difference, I think, between the Cold War clash as represented on both sides, and certainly as seen from the United States, where they were dealing with evil, however described, right? The world of slavery or the evil empire, whatever. But with a world that did see itself as different, that did describe itself as oppositional, as self-sufficient, as expanding, if not necessarily expansionist. Today, it's not, Russia is usually described as just the way sometimes the servants of Satan are described in Christian literature, that basically they're just after mischief. They're there to cause mischief and to undermine democracy. And at this point, democracy is, I guess, the central concept in the way the West is represented. Not so much freedom anymore, although it's there, but democracy, I think, as a concept is used a lot more often. But anyway, Russia is represented mostly as Putin, and Putin's goal is, even if it's described as one of empire building, it's not clear on what basis. Right, there were used during the Cold War, there were debates, is the Soviet Union, is it expanding because of its ideology, which is a communist ideology, which is inherently expansionist, or because of the Russian imperial something rather. Now it's not clear to me what, and again, you know better how to describe various approaches, but I don't really see Russia as, from the as represented in the United States as a civilization with its values, and they may be awful values, but still, China may be seen as a civilization inferior to the Western one because it's not committed to the individual and individual rights and so on. And here I would, by the way, I would add one other thing, and this where I think that this the contradictory nature of Western self-representation has grown since the end of the Cold War, and that is that as Western civilization as a concept has declined, so human rights as a global ideology has risen. And so we have this situation where Lavrov talks about the West as a civilization as well as a military alliance, and the West talks less about itself and its values and history, and more about global human values, human rights in particular, rooted in human nature, not in its own history. So I think there are kind of difficulties on both sides, but I think in Russia, at least in Russian political circles, the West is represented as a much more meaningful entity than Russia is in the West.
I think that that's very fair. The only possible exception I could see to that would be in sort of policy conversations about the Russian Orthodox Church and its malign influence. I mean, it's folded into the sort of mischief making of the Kremlin for the most part. That's the basic thrust of the analysis. But there's a certain civilizational concern that it will contribute in the Balkans and elsewhere to sort of negative political tendencies, and that for civilizational reasons, sort of civilization as a smokescreen for the true interests of the Kremlin. But I think you're right that it's not idea-driven, that it's Putin-driven, sort of personality-driven, or this is the word that you very often hear, regime-driven. So it's not a civilization; it's a regime, and that's the that's the thing that that really matters. I want, before asking my sort of final question, to address what I see as a sort of intersecting irony at the present moment, given the conflict between the U.S. And Russia, and it has very much to do with civilization. And I think that Putin has closely associated Russian civilization. I would assume that Lavrov does the same in his text, with state power. But it's unclear to me how much this top-down project generates true popular support. I think we heard from Dmitry Trenin yesterday about the sort of fragmented notion of Russian political society at the present moment, more critical than I would have expected him to be. And then we also heard from Vodolaskin, who says that the higher values in life don't come from politics, they come from literature. So we shouldn't even look in a way to politics with these sort of higher values of life. I don't think by that he was criticizing Putin, but he was sort of disassociating the political world from the cultural world. So I'm not sure how much genuine civilizational energy there really is that's sort of in the name of the Russian state at the present moment. I think there's some, but I'm not sure how much it really sort of speaks to younger, more creative Russians. And of course, there's a great precedent for that, both in Soviet and Imperial Russian history, where the creative energy just sort of seems to exist in some tension, from Pushkin forward, in some tension with the sort of official and state-driven sense of what Russian society is about and what Russian culture should be. So if that tension is there, I think it's sort of mirrored in some ways in an American situation where, although from the outside world, there are countries that very much worry about the assertiveness of the West, many countries, but the term of art, the West, has really faded away almost entirely from respectable American intellectual life. And to me, the most vivid example of this at the moment, it's not quite about the West, but it's sort of this irony that strikes me, is that you have a Biden administration that's robustly Wilsonian in its foreign policy, right? A world of autocracies and democracies, and we need to be, sort of American leadership, and as was Obama, as was Reagan, as were many presidents after Wilson, a sort of strong embrace of these Wilsonian concepts. But at the same time, in Washington, D.C., there's a strong movement that I think will soon succeed to rename Woodrow Wilson High School after someone else, because Woodrow Wilson is associated with segregation and sort of his convictions and views. And these are two separate things, but it's at the very least an irony that Wilson would be sort of the main figure still in American foreign policy as it conceives himself, but he's so controversial now as a historical figure that his name has been removed from the Princeton School, and I'm sure will soon be removed from the school in Washington, D.C. So there seems to be a kind of tension also, or a stark divide almost between the official policies of the United States, the official foreign policy, and the sort of true direction of American culture. But I wanted to ask you about this tension, Yuri, as you see it, between sort of the projection of this and sort of power politics, but then this very complicated reality on the ground, sort of wrestling with civilizational notions by the people of Russia and of the United States.
Well, I think that both are in trouble. That I agree with your description of the situation in Russia. I would add, the way I think Putin and others describe what Russia stands for today is indeed connected to the history, strength, health of the Russian state, but also some sort of vague references to tradition, including orthodoxy, culture, family, and so on. Things that they claim are in trouble in the West. But of course, what is interesting and I think crucially important is that a very large contingent within the Russian intellectual elite, probably the majority of its members, are pro-Western and do not share Putin's agenda, and indeed identify with the West and the West's policy with regard to Russia. It's interesting that Lavrov, in his letter, said that these people that the West counts on, are a tiny, tiny, negligible minority in Russia. And I think that this is maybe numerically true, but to see that group as negligible is a terrible mistake at best. Because the same one could say about the Russian intellectual elite, otherwise known as the intelligentsia, in the late imperial Russia, and then in the Soviet Union. And I think the regime's refusal to attempt to incorporate that group politically is maybe suicidal. Although whether they are, can be incorporated is another question. But it's interesting that all attempts to that, efforts to that effect seem to have been abandoned. So there is, I think, potentially a very dangerous cleavage there. And then on the US side, and we have referred to this, indeed on the Western side in general, again, if this conversation is devoted to the concept of civilization and civilizational competition and so on, then what is clear is that what used to be the West, a community united by a common literary canon, is no longer, right? The West does not have a common literary canon anymore. The Christian one is mostly gone from education systems and even political speeches for the most part. The Greco-Roman one that used to be so important for elite training, I guess most recently in the UK, is also on its way out. But what is interesting is that the vernacular canons that replaced them are also in decline and in trouble in Western Europe, certainly not in Eastern Europe or in Russia. But in Western Europe, the place of Goethe and Shakespeare is not what it used to be 50 years ago. And of course, in the United States, the sacrality of the founding fathers and Declaration of Independence and Constitution is in trouble. And so I agree with what you said about this sort of Wilsonian paradox, but I think it goes much farther. I think, in other words, I am not sure nobody knows, of course, what will happen, but this is truly a revolution, I think, that's happening. When we were talking about if indeed Western Christendom was replaced by, on the one hand, national cultures organized around vernacular canons on the one hand, and this, if you will, messianic entity, the United States, that claimed to kind of stand for the West as a whole, and at the same time, but was not organized along the same national lines, both are being questioned, both principles. And so the West persists as the world's most powerful empire, if you will, most powerful military alliance, financial entity, informational, and so on and so forth. But it seems to be kind of hollow in the middle in some very important sense. And I think that your book points to it, except that since your book came out, things have gotten more dire. And I'm not here, in my Cassandra role, just trying to describe what I see within that particular framework of civilizational analysis.
Well, this takes me to my final question, which goes in a somewhat different direction, and we'll turn the floor over to you, the students. And I wanted to ask finally about bridges, because there seem to be so many between Russia and the United States. And it's as interesting as the recurrent conflicts between these two countries or these two powers is a sort of recurring cultural or civilizational connection. So I think of Alexander Herzen, who names his magazine The Bell after the Liberty Bell in Philadelphia. Even Tolstoy had, sort of low-key but interesting preoccupations with figures like Thoreau and others from American life. Soviet dissidents who turned to the United States, not just for a kind of material support, as they did in some cases, but to understand the norms and sort of values that they were agitating for. And I think where we would find this maybe most vibrant at the moment would be in journalism. You have all of these sort of opposition, independent, critical journalists, some of them living in Latvia, Lithuania, or in the United States. And I think there's a kind of inspiration that's drawn from the tradition of a free press in the United States and sort of political pluralism and political back and forth. And so we can look to this sort of interesting set of connections that runs through Russian culture from the 19th century to the present and draws upon certain American precedents. And likewise, in the US, you have the enormous prestige of Russian literature, which maybe it's not quite what it was in the decades immediately after the Second World War, when you have these booming Russian literature programs, but is still, sort of prominent. The ways in which writers like Dostoevsky are fundamental to the development of Ralph Ellison and many other American writers. That list sort of goes on and on. You have the diaspora populations, Russian diaspora populations in the United States, which are, sort of the culture and life of the U.S. is unthinkable without these figures, from, sort of Nabokov to Joseph Brodsky to many, many others in the worlds of business and politics as well. But you also have figures like John Reed and Donald Trump who look admiringly to Russian politics, sort of see something of value there. We can sort of dismiss that aspect of Trump as sort of a monstrous element of his political worldview, but in many ways it's just more interesting than not that he spoke so admiringly of Russia. And of course, on the American left, going back to sort of early Soviet times, there's a huge amount of admiration and connection. You could think of a life like Paul Robeson's life, right, where he sort of turned to Russia, and it was Russia in his case as well as the Soviet Union, for a certain kind of inspiration. So I wanted to ask you, Yuri, about the bridge crossers and the people who have gone sort of across civilizational lines and felt like they profited from an admiration when, maybe in the official political world, there was more of an effort to build borders. In the cultural and sort of imaginative world, you just as often see bridges.
Well, I think obviously there are all kinds of connections, but I would emphasize the asymmetry, because I think it wouldn't be entirely fair to talk about these two competitors or two entities clashing or facing each other, and then a bridge connecting them with some sort of pedestrian traffic in both directions. I think the asymmetry is striking. Like, the United States is the center of a global empire. Its charisma is enormous. A large portion of the Russian elite is passionately in love with it. The Americans who were in love with the Soviet Union were mostly interested in communism. Sometimes Russia, and more or less you couldn't easily divide the two, but Russia was and could be part of the package, but it was essentially the Soviet Union. and the dream of communism and the certain universalist ideology that the Soviet Union represented. I think that's true of both John Reed and Paul Robeson and so many others. And indeed, for a while, that attraction was important enough to make Senator McCarthy possible. But in today's world, what is Russia's charisma and attraction to the United States? It's non-existent. It's not. I mean, the literature is, I think, is exceedingly marginal in the marginal presence in American life. I remember, at least in the 90s, your basic coverage of Russia in US media, and there would be some political reports, but there would also be all sorts of sometimes very cheesy stories about church bells, or about some quaint community in Siberia, or about some writer. Now it's very rare. I mean, the image is almost entirely negative, politically so. And again, it's just a matter of A, scale, and B, but, and here I would add one thing that strikes me as very interesting. Given the enormous asymmetry, right? Russia may be dismissed, as Obama did, as a regional power, or even as a gas station with an army, or whatever the expression was, or it can be represented as ubiquitous source of evil around the world. But one way or another, it is not comparable to the United States in so many ways. And its presence in America, I think, is negligible, other than a source of political threat. And who would follow Trump in his admiration for Putin? Anyway, we can talk more about this, because there are certainly people around the world, and especially in Western Europe. If you take Uber in France or in Amsterdam, most drivers, when ask me where I'm from, and they hear I'm from Russia, tell me go Putin. But that's a different question. But what I was going to say, that given that enormous asymmetry, the West, and the United States in particular, does not seem anywhere near as self-confident politically and culturally as it did in the 1970s during the late Cold War period. Back then, everyone assumed, or let's say both sides assumed, that any student exchange might result in some Soviets wanting to stay in the United States. Any informational exchange might result, or should result, or will result in Soviets hearing the word of truth. And who in America ever bothered with Radio Moscow? It was kind of a more or less noticeable, I think, presence in parts of the so-called Third World, but certainly not in the West by the 1970s. And so one side jammed the Voice of America and Deutsche Welle and the rest of them, and the other didn't worry about it at all. And now, given the asymmetry, they do this endless talk about Russian propaganda, fake news, all this stuff. I'm in Latvia today, RT is banned. I used to begin my day by looking at the lowest common denominator around the world. CNN, Fox News, the BBC, Al Jazeera, and RT, just to see what the clowns are saying. In Latvia, I cannot see the Russian official point of view unless I just look at the Russian channel. But I was curious about the way they sell themselves, or sell themselves to the West in English, which is interesting. But you could not do it in Latvian. It says it's unsafe. There's nothing you can do about it. They also banned most Russian TV stations and radio stations and so on. But that's not just true of Latvia. This talk is everywhere, and it's somehow terribly dangerous to hear from them. And again, given the asymmetry of power, economic, financial, you can't sanction the United States. It can only be done in the opposite direction. it's very interesting to me. And I was curious how you would explain this, the disappearance of this remarkable self-confidence that the West had back in the late Cold War period.
I don't know if I do have an explanation for it. Certainly, if you would look at the discourse now about decline, you know, it's every third op-ed in the New York Times is about the possible decline of democracy. You know, that seems like a very reasonable subject to be debating at the present moment. That I think is not so much geopolitical. That's, you know, internal to the United States. But what's more striking and would simply be worth very careful consideration and study is the lack of cultural confidence, sort of broadly speaking, although not of the people who run American foreign policy for the most part. I mean, they still seem, although you're right, these sort of anxieties are mounting, but they still seem to speak a language that's almost 20, 30 years old. I think that what has come home to the United States after 2008, in particular with the financial crisis, and then a series of foreign policy setbacks, starting with Ukraine, but also in the Middle East. You have the withdrawal of from Afghanistan as we speak, which is reminiscent a little bit of the fall of Saigon in 1975. The sort of Western model is, globally speaking, quite a bit weaker than it used to be. It's less attractive, it's less influential, it's less able to sort of get results. And I think that was the very grudging realization of the Obama administration. They began with these great hopes about, you know, sort of bringing the Western model to the world at large. Certainly, Bill Clinton had those hopes, and I think they ended sort of clutching the relationship with Angela Merkel and sort of hoping that would sort of stay up and running because everything else seemed to be crumbling and falling apart around them. So I think it's a complicated intersection of internal cultural ferment and chaos up to a point, and then a geopolitical situation where the US is just less able to get the results it wants, and that induces, I think, a kind of fear. And so you worry about RT in that context, you know, in ways that would have been unthinkable, exactly as you point out, in the 1970s. But perhaps we turn to our students now, and I'm just going to make one final point about the decline of Russian studies. It's conforms to exactly what you were saying, Yuri, a sort of decreasing interest in Russian language, you know, sort of fewer American students who are studying Russian history, Russian literature. That would suggest a kind of, you know, sort of profound lack of interest, which you do feel in the sort of broader media culture as well. But since the students are such robust exceptions to that trend that we have with us, let's turn the floor over to them and see what their concerns are.